It's difficult for us to do political forecasting at the moment when really the only person who knows what's going to happen next is President Vladimir Putin of Russia. So instead of actually making a clear forecast about where this war is going to go, we present scenarios. And those scenarios give you an idea of what could happen depending on how this war progresses. The most likely of those scenarios is that Russia defeats Ukraine in this war. Russia still has huge firepower and we can see it intensifying its war efforts. The likely outcome there is that Ukraine is forced to accept certain Russian demands and large swathes of Ukrainian territory fall under Russian control. Of course, Russia could yet, but probably less likely, topple the Ukrainian government and install a puppet government in the same way that it's done in Belarus, for example. There could be a negotiated end to the war. In fact, efforts are ongoing in that area, but it's very hard to understand what it is that both sides could agree to. That will be a rather imperfect solution, we guess. Russia could yet be defeated. And of course, everyone has been surprised by the strength of the Ukrainian army and the strength of Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Russia faces a humiliating retreat from Ukraine. And if that happens, then we could probably expect regime change in Moscow. Finally, and probably the apocalyptic outcome here is that NATO gets dragged into this war. Perhaps unintentionally, something happens and the fighting or missiles rain down on NATO territory. Or indeed, we see an escalation of the war, perhaps Russians reverting to chemical or nuclear weapons, in which case NATO will be forced to respond, and then we are really looking at a global conflagration. That, we think, is still yet quite an unlikely outcome, but it could yet happen by mistake as much as anything else. The global implications of the conflict are threefold. An impact on global growth. Actually, we don't yet see much contagion in terms of negative impact on global growth outside of Russia and Ukraine, a little bit on Eastern Europe, and we have reduced our European forecasts somewhat. You saw from my earlier slide, we're expecting global growth of 3.1%, marked down from 3.9%, but that is largely based on the fall in the size of the Russian economy. Russia is a big enough economy to move the dial for the global economy. Inflation and commodity prices. Commodity prices spiking, particularly those that are supplied in large amounts by Russia. We've seen Europe in particular realising that it is over-reliant on Russian gas and working quite hard now to try to diversify its supply chain. Inflation spiking globally to over 6% this year. Here in South Africa, a little bit less than that, but nevertheless, that is going to impact on the costs of living for people around the world. And of course, it is forcing central banks to raise interest rates to counter the effects of inflation, and that will make debt more expensive. The impact on Africa, relatively limited. Compared to countries across Europe and in the Northern Hemisphere, we are seeing an impact potentially on the supply of foodstuffs. There are a lot of countries in Africa very dependent on Russian and Ukrainian wheat, for example, on cooking oils, on fertilisers. All of those things are going to get much more expensive and much harder to come by. So that's important. 14 of the countries highlighted on this map buy arms from Russia. And so, of course, that will be difficult to maintain given the significant sanctions that have been placed on the economy. And indeed, there are a lot of energy investments across the region that are dependent on Russian money. So those are the main things that we see impacting Russia. But for South Africa, Russian imports and exports to Russia, less than 1% of the total in each direction.